Look at the top floor of that building. Count the windows. That is not a normal house. Normal houses do not need that many windows. Normal people in normal homes doing normal things do not need that much light. That is a weaver's cottage. The top floor was a loom room. The long windows let in enough light to weave by. The most important requirement for a craft that demanded precision in every thread, in every pattern, in every inch of cloth. In 1820, there were 170,000 hand loom weavers in Lancashire alone, each one working in a cottage like this, each one a skilled craftsman or craftswoman who had served years of apprenticeship to learn a trade that could support a family, maintain a community, and produce goods that were sold across the world. By 1860, there were 55,000. By 1891, almost none. The Industrial Revolution is taught as a story of invention, of the spinning jenny and the power loom and the steam engine and the extraordinary transformation that turned Britain into the workshop of the world. That story is true, but there is another story, the one told by those darkening windows, by the communities that existed before the factories arrived, by the skilled workers who found their craft made worthless, their communities dissolved, their way of life declared obsolete by men who had never held a shuttle. The Industrial Revolution did not build those communities. It demolished them and called the rubble progress. To understand what was destroyed by the Industrial Revolution, you first have to understand what existed before it. The domestic system, sometimes called cottage industry, sometimes called the putting out system, was how Britain had manufactured textiles for centuries. It was not primitive. It was not inefficient in the way that matters to a community. It was the foundation on which whole regions had built their social and economic life. Here is how it worked. A merchant would bring raw wool or cotton to a network of cottage workers. The children carded it, untangling and aligning the fibres. The women spun it into yarn using a spinning wheel. The men wove the yarn into cloth on a hand loom. The merchant collected the finished cloth, paid for the work, and took it to other workers for finishing, dyeing and cutting. Every stage of this process happened in or near the workers' homes. The loom stood in the main room of the cottage, or in a purpose-built loom room at the top, lit by those long windows. The family worked together. The children learned the trade as they grew. The neighbourhood shared the same craft, the same merchant relationships, the same seasonal rhythms. This was a community of skill. The framework knitters of Nottinghamshire had their own guild structures, their own systems for maintaining standards, their own mechanisms for collective bargaining. The croppers of Yorkshire, who finished woolen cloth using heavy mechanical shears, were the most highly paid textile workers in Britain. Men who had trained for years, who commanded wages that could support a comfortable life, who had genuine social standing in their communities. In 1800, a skilled hand loom weaver could earn wages that compared favourably with a school teacher. Their communities had pubs, churches, schools, local political structures. They were not marginal people living at the edges of the economy. They were the economy. The machines arrived incrementally. That is one of the things that made the destruction so difficult to resist. James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny in 1764. Richard Arkwright's water frame followed in 1769. Samuel Crompton's spinning mule in 1779. Edmund Cartwright's power loom in 1785. Each machine in isolation seemed like a practical improvement. Each one increased the speed of a single stage in the manufacturing process. Each one made it possible to produce more cloth at lower cost. But together, and within the factory system that Arkwright pioneered at Cromford in Derbyshire, they represented something more fundamental than efficiency. They represented the removal of skill from the production of cloth. A child tending a power loom could produce cloth. A child of 10, hired for wages far below what any adult craftsman would accept, working shifts that a skilled adult would have refused in conditions that the domestic system would never have imposed on a family member. At Arkwright's Cromford mill, children made up 2/3 of the 2,000-person workforce, not as apprentices learning a craft, as cheap labour operating machines that required no skill to run. For the skilled weavers and spinners and croppers in the cottage communities of Yorkshire, Lancashire and Nottinghamshire, this was not an abstract economic threat. It was the destruction of everything they had built. Their craft, years of learning, generations of accumulated knowledge, the thing that gave them standing in their community and wages above the poverty line, was being made worthless, not by bad luck, not by natural disaster, by a deliberate decision of manufacturers who had calculated that unskilled child labour was cheaper than skilled adult labour and had acted on that calculation. The domestic system did not collapse quickly, it took decades, but the direction was visible from the beginning and the people it was happening to knew it. The destruction of the domestic system was not sudden. It played out over a generation, and the statistics tell the story with a precision that the individual lives behind them cannot. In Lancashire, the peak years of handloom weaving were around 1820. 170,000 weavers. The census of 1851 recorded 55,000, 1861 30,000, 1871 10,000, 1891 almost none. 70 years, 160,000 skilled workers. Their trade gone. But the numbers do not capture what those 70 years felt like to the communities living through them. In the early period, 1800 to 1815, hand-loom weavers could still earn a living. The machines had not yet caught up with all the varieties of cloth. There was still demand for skilled hand weaving. Then, over the 1820s and 1830s, the power loom spread. Wages for handloom weavers began to fall, then fell further, then fell to a point where a full week's weaving could not feed a family. What do you do when the skill you spent years learning is suddenly worth nothing? You keep weaving, because you have no other skill, because the loom is in your house, and the house has the long windows, and the merchant is still coming, even if he is paying less. Because your children grew up watching you weave and know nothing else. Because stopping means admitting that everything you built your life on was wrong. Handloom weavers continued working through the 1820s, 1830s and 1840s at wages that fell year by year. Contemporary accounts describe families living on bread and potatoes, selling furniture to survive, pawning the loom itself in the end. The community that had sustained them, the pub, the church, the school, the networks of mutual support, began to dissolve as the wages that had funded it dried up. Not all at once. The way communities always dissolve, slowly then suddenly. In November 1811, a group of framework knitters in Arnold, Nottinghamshire, broke into a workshop and destroyed 5 stocking frames. The Luddite movement had begun. The name Luddite came from a mythical figure, General Ned Ludd or King Ludd, said to live in Sherwood Forest and lead the resistance. He had not existed, but that is often how movements find their voice, through the fiction of a leader who cannot be arrested. The Luddites were not, as they are now remembered, people opposed to technology in general. That caricature was invented by their enemies and has survived because it is useful. The Luddites were skilled textile workers, the stockingers of Nottinghamshire, the croppers of Yorkshire, the weavers of Lancashire, whose specific, particular, hard-won skills were being made worthless by specific machines. They were not opposed to all machines. They were opposed to the machines that were destroying their trades. And they made the distinction very precisely. In Yorkshire, the croppers targeted shearing frames and gig mills, the specific machines replacing their finishing work. In Nottinghamshire, the stockingers targeted wide frames that produced cheap inferior goods, undercutting the quality standards they had spent years building. In Lancashire, the weavers targeted power looms. The raids were organised, coordinated, and often conducted at night by men who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly which machines they were there to destroy. This was not a riot. It was a targeted campaign by skilled workers defending the communities their skill had built. The government's response was the Frame Breaking Act of 1812, which made machine breaking a capital offence. At Rawfolds Mill near Huddersfield in April 1812, mill owner William Cartwright had fortified his factory with armed guards. When Luddites attacked, the guards opened fire. 2 Luddites were shot dead, others were wounded. That summer, 17 Luddite prisoners were executed at York, publicly, as a lesson. 12,000 soldiers were deployed to the textile counties to suppress the movement, more troops than Wellington had in Portugal. 12,000 soldiers deployed against textile workers defending their communities. Think about that number. The children who replaced the skilled adult workers in the factories were not apprentices. They were cheap labour. Factory commissioners who inspected mills in the 1830s and 1840s recorded what they found. Children of 5, 6, 7 years old, working 12 and 14-hour shifts. Children who had never learned to read. Children who started work in the mills before dawn and finished after dark. Who saw daylight only on Sundays. At Arkwright's Cromford mill, children made up 2/3 of the workforce. They cleaned beneath the machines while the machines were running. The accidents were recorded with the same matter-of-fact tone as the production figures. This is the other side of the story that is missing from the standard Industrial Revolution narrative. The domestic system was not gentle. Cottage workers worked long hours. Children in weaving families worked too. Life before the factories was not pastoral or idyllic, but the domestic system had something the factory system did not. It had community. The children who worked in a weaving cottage worked alongside their parents in their home, learning a craft that would support them as adults. Embedded in a neighbourhood where every family shared the same trade and the same rhythms. The work was hard, the hours were long, but the social structure it created, the mutual support, the shared identity, the sense of belonging to something that had existed before you were born and would continue after you died, that was real. The factory system dissolved that social structure and replaced it with nothing. Workers who had lived in craft communities of a few hundred people where everyone knew each other's skill and standing were relocated, sometimes forcibly, sometimes by economic necessity, into the mill towns that were growing at a speed no civic infrastructure could match. Manchester grew from 25,000 people in 1772 to 316,000 by 1850 in 78 years. There were no schools, no sanitation, no civic institutions adequate to a city that size. The communities that the domestic system had sustained simply ceased to exist. The people who had formed them were now urban workers in a city that did not yet know what to do with them. The people who built the factories understood, at least some of them, what they were doing. Robert Owen, who owned cotton mills in New Lanark, Scotland, built schools for his workers' children, banned child labour under 10, limited the working day, provided decent housing. He proved that a factory could be profitable without destroying the community around it. Parliament ignored him for decades. The first Factory Act to have any real teeth was passed in 1833. It limited children under 9 from working in textile mills. It required 2 hours of education per day for child workers. It appointed inspectors to enforce it. It passed 47 years after Arkwright opened his first mill. 47 years during which children had worked 14-hour shifts beneath running machinery. In 1819, in a field called St. Peter's Field in Manchester, the same city that had grown from 25,000 to 100,000 in 50 years, a crowd of 60,000 people gathered to demand parliamentary representation. They wanted the vote. They wanted to change the laws that govern their working lives through the legitimate political process. The local magistrates sent in cavalry. 15 people died. Hundreds were injured. It was called Peterloo, a bitter reference to Waterloo 4 years earlier, where British soldiers had defeated Napoleon. The same government that had sent 12,000 soldiers to protect factory machines from Luddites sent cavalry to cut down civilians asking for the vote. The communities that the Industrial Revolution demolished did not go quietly, but they went. The weavers' cottages are still there. Across West Yorkshire, Lancashire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, you can find them in almost every older village and small town. Sometimes they have been converted into ordinary homes, the loom rooms turned into bedrooms or storage, but the windows are unmistakable. That long row of glass across the top floor, still letting in light. In 1820, 170,000 weavers in Lancashire alone worked behind windows like those. They had names, they had trades, they had children who expected to inherit their skill and their standing. By 1891, the census counted almost none. The standard history of the Industrial Revolution is a story of progress, and in measurable terms, life expectancy, material wealth, global influence, Britain did progress. The factories produced goods at a scale and speed that no domestic system could have matched. The railway connected communities that had been isolated for centuries. The steam engine transformed everything. All of that is true. But progress is not neutral. It has a direction and a cost. The direction was decided by the people who owned the machines. The cost was paid by the people who had owned the skill. The framework knitters of Nottingham, whose trade was 300 years old when the wide frames made it worthless. The croppers of Yorkshire, the most skilled and best paid textile workers in Britain, whose craft was abolished by a machine in less than a decade. The handloom weavers of Lancashire, 170,000 strong at their peak, reduced to almost nothing in 70 years. They did not resist progress, they resisted erasure. The difference matters. That is what those windows are still trying to say. That is what Finding Lost Britain is for. If this story changed how you understand the Industrial Revolution, share it. Because the spinning jenny and the power loom are still in every history textbook. Arkwright and Hargreaves and Cartwright still have their monuments. The 170,000 weavers who lost their trade, their communities, and their standing in a single generation, they do not. Subscribe to Finding Lost Britain, where the stories that Progress wrote over are still being recovered.